Okay, I'm just waiting to check that that's definitely working.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
We're live, Antoine. I'm just checking that we're live. There's like a 15-second delay on the YouTube. And it appears we are live. Okay. So, first of all, anybody watching on the YouTube stream, apologies. We've had some problems with Jitsi. So I've now moved to Zoom. You should probably be able to see Zoom in the bottom right-hand corner. But at least the live stream's working, and I think we've got Kevin and Antoine on the call, which is good, and a few others as well. Okay, so this is London Bitcoin Devs. This is on Zoom and live streaming on YouTube. Last week we had a Socratic seminar on vaults, covenants, check template verify. There's a video up for that. There's also a transcript up for that, BTC transcripts on Twitter. Questions? Kevin and Antoine are probably going to pause during the presentation for questions and comments, but we're not going to have interruptions, so we're going to let them speak until they pause. There'll be a Q&A afterwards for questions. Kevin has also said he's going to start from like basics, foundation level, so don't ask advanced technical questions at the beginning. He'll probably cover more of the advanced technical stuff in the, towards the middle and the end. Apart from that, I think I just need to introduce Kevin and Antoine, and then we can get going. So Kevin Loaec and Antoine Poinsot. Kevin I know from Breaking Bitcoin, Building on Bitcoin conferences, which were amazing, hackathons and conferences and all the events around that. Also, Kevin works at Chainsmiths and is building a growing Bitcoin community in Lisbon. Antoine spoke at London Bitcoin Devs in person a couple of months ago on C Lightning plugins. So I watched that presentation on YouTube. That was really good. And some of that C Lightning work is really interesting. But today he's going to be talking about vaults and in specifically the vault design Revault. So after all that drama, hopefully we can get going. Kevin, are you ready to take it away?
I think I am. Let me try to share my screen and it should be all right. All good?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you. So hopefully that will be the end of our problems. Take it away, Kevin.
All right. Well, thanks for the intro. And so, yeah, I'm going to try to make my part of the presentation about 40 minutes long, and then Antoine will go to the hardcore discussion on very, very deep technicalities after that. So it's going to be a little bit long, maybe an hour and a half total. So I'll try to make some pauses for you to ask questions from time to time, but I might forget. So if it's really long and I don't let anybody do questions, don't hesitate to ping me. Yeah, so we're going to talk about Revault, and Revault is an architecture, a vault architecture that Antoine and I have been working on for the past 5 months now, so since December. And as you will see, it's targeted at institutions, so not people as such. But this presentation will talk about everything from the basic of how we do security today on Bitcoin for individuals and institutions. And then I will look at the different propositions and different kind of things we can do today with Bitcoin for individuals and institutions. And then I go directly into Revault, what we've built. So what we have and how it works. And then, yeah, Antoine will talk about very specific details about the architecture that if you are really into Bitcoin development, you might have some questions or you might not have considered some of the attacks possible. And so Antoine will cover a lot of those. And it's really, really interesting in my opinion. So the more it will go, the more technical it will be. So if it's too simple for you at the beginning, that's normal. It will just go increasingly. And if you are a beginner, at some point, if you drop out, just expect the rest of the discussion to be even more technical. But yeah, I'm trying to do my best to not lose anybody at the beginning. Hopefully, it's not going to be too simple either at the beginning. All right, so let's dive into this. I think the first interesting thing I want to talk about is how we do Bitcoin today. So we have ownership. So how do we own Bitcoin? So we have the question that is like, who controls the keys? And this is the first part of how you can, let's say, defend or protect your Bitcoin, right? So you have three choices here. You can deal with a third-party custodian. So let's say you leave your coins on an exchange. You don't control the keys. So it's not really your Bitcoins. But that's one way of doing it. The other one is to self-control your key or keys. So if you own all of your keys, then you really own your Bitcoin. Nobody can, block them or steal them away from you if they don't have your keys, your private keys, I mean. And then you also have the mixed model where you and another party have keys to move the coins. So this is about control, right? So a mixed party like that could be Green, if you know the Blockstream Green wallet. It has two signatures. You sign one, and then you send the transaction to them, and they co-sign it. So even if your key is lost, that's fine, because nobody can steal your funds without having the key from a Green address. Then the second question around ownership is about key management. So the first slide, this one, is about who has these keys, but the second one is about how these keys are secured somewhat. You have different approaches again. One popular one is called cold storage. You might have heard that for exchanges, for example. So a cold storage is an address or a set of keys that you are not supposed to ever touch. So that's the ones that have been generated offline. I've never touched a computer connected online and are not supposed to be used ever until you need to move the coins. So think of that as like burying a treasure chest in your garden, right? The second one could be having hardware or offline wallets. So an offline wallet could just be a laptop that you removed all the connectivity from, right? So you remove the Wi-Fi chip, you remove all networking capability, and you generate your keys on this thing, and this one will never touch the internet. So this is made a little bit different from a cold storage. This is supposed to be used to spend your coins, but the key itself, the private key, will never touch a computer connected online. So this is probably what now most people use. Back in the days, it was paper wallet, like a cold storage. So you would have the ones that you never use, and then you would have like a smaller wallet on your phone or computer that you would use for transactions. Now most people are using hardware wallets. Then you can go YOLO, meaning you have all your funds on your phone or all your phone on your computer, your funds on your computers. This is extremely risky, of course, because the threat model is extremely high. Your computer being stolen, malware installed on your computer, anything. You have a lot of risk there. So don't ever put all your funds on a laptop or on your phone, right? And then you can also play around with multisig. So you could have multiple hardware wallets. You could have one key on a hardware wallet, one key on your phone, one key on your computer. In that case, even if one or multiple keys leak, that's all right, depending on how the multisig is designed. So out of these two slides, the first one where the keys are, well, who control the keys, and the second one on how they are kept, pretty much define every way of storing Bitcoin today. As far as I know, that's like 99.999% of how coins are secure. Your own Bitcoin are probably behind one of these solutions or a mix of these two right now. And this is not good enough. This is really not good enough. This is just about securing keys. We're not talking about securing the Bitcoin itself. As soon as the keys are leaked, your Bitcoin are gone. So vaults are talking about that. When we're saying we're dealing with a vault, we're not dealing with just a key solution. We're dealing with a way to restrict how Bitcoin can move. I think that's the main point that I want to cover here. So then you have threat models to discuss. Threat models are quite complex to list because they depend for each person or each group of people. Let's say the main one up till now was the online threat, how a malware cannot steal your keys. So that's why your keys should never be on your computer or on your phone, right? This is the main threat you have today. Then you have the physical attack. It's somebody coming to you and just threatening you to give them the Bitcoin. As you can already think, if I come to you and I start breaking your fingers, you probably will dig this cold storage wallet you have, your cold wallet in your garden, right? Because being in your garden doesn't mean you cannot access it. So if I really force you to do it, you will give it to me. So that's not enough as a security model. Then you have third-party risk. So of course, if you give all your Bitcoin to Coinbase, then you are pretty much protected from the random guy coming to you. But Coinbase now can steal your Bitcoin, and that's another problem. So you're creating other risks sometimes to solve the first ones. And then for multi-party solution, you also have the insider attacks. So of course, when it's only your Bitcoin, you're fine. But if it's now a company, it's a little bit harder, right? How do you deal with like your co-founders if it's a startup going away with the coins, or how do you deal with your IT guy having access to your private keys on your exchange and maybe stealing them? So that's another problem that we have to think of. So when you're designing security solutions around keys, you're trying to think about that. But when you're designing vaults, you really are trying to figure out all the different types of attacks that could happen, because if they can happen, they will happen, especially for big players like exchanges. So what we want, yeah, so this slide is really about what we're trying to achieve here. So the perfect solution for vaults would look like this. We would be able to restrict where the funds can go. So that's saying, if your address is not in a whitelist or something, your funds, your UTXO cannot move to it. This is impossible to do today with Bitcoin, right? We would like maybe to restrict how much Bitcoin can move, maybe per day or per week. So let's say if you have, I don't know, you're super rich and you have like 100 Bitcoin somewhere, and you want to protect yourself and to allow you only to spend 1 Bitcoin a month, right now that cannot be done. The Bitcoin network doesn't care how many of your Bitcoin you are spending. And a vault or a covenant could be interesting for doing that. So if you're not supposed to spend more than a Bitcoin a month, can we somehow enforce this at protocol level or on the second layer? And then you also have the when. So that could be, for example, during business hours. If you're a business, the funds should not move during the night because your employees are only there during the day. So could we enforce that? Or as an individual, it could be only during the hours where you're awake. So a theft, even if it's a malware or anything, wouldn't be able to move your funds during the night. So this is kind of restriction we want in a vault. And also, yeah, as quickly discussed before, most of the solution we can think of also add risk. So yeah, let's say the where here, if I only allow myself to send my coins to Kraken, what happens if Kraken disappears? Then all my coins are locked forever because Kraken addresses don't exist anymore. This is really difficult, or make it unusable. So unusability is quite interesting as well, because in security, you have this principle that if your system is too hard to use or too annoying to use, people are not going to use it. So it might be secure, but just because it's annoying on a day-to-day basis to use it, people are going to bypass it. And so your security is defeated just because it was unusable or too hard to use. So this is also something very important when we design security solutions. And lastly, what I wanted to cover, I like this slide. What I wanted to cover here is that Bitcoin is in theory pretty cool, but the practical Bitcoin we have today is a very limited set of blocks. We cannot do whatever we want with it. So we have a specific amount of tools that we can play with, and we can probably build anything with it, but we have to be really smart about how we do it. We cannot just ask, the Bitcoin core dev to be like, oh, we need a new covenant opcode. Can you please do it? So everything takes ages to be added and modified in Bitcoin, because that's the way Bitcoin is designed, and I'm really happy with that. So I'm okay to have a Bitcoin that's really restricted for security reasons, but also that means that I have to play with the rules. So I have to use whatever basic blocks I have and build with that. I cannot just expect Bitcoin to change to fit my needs. And that's why today vaults are not available on the market. Nobody is giving what we call vaults as a service, so you don't have software to do that. Most of the software you can get today on Bitcoin, like the best ones, the most advanced one, would be just multisig. So we want to go further than that. Yeah, I think right now I can do a short, pause if somebody wants to ask a question on the call. I don't know if you have any right now. Is everything I'm saying quite clear?
For me, yeah, I think good so far. Anybody else on the call? You can raise your hand if you want to have a comment or question. Otherwise,
Sounds good.
see if I hear anything. Okay, continue, Kevin.
Cool. So that was a very basic. Now, what we have today on Bitcoin as these, basic blocks are this. So this is probably the two ones we can use at the protocol level. We can use multisig. So that's having multiple people required, or multiple keys required to sign to be able to spend a transaction. So that could be multiple people or not. That could be multiple devices or whatever. And we also have time locks. So I'm going to cover the time locks after that. And lastly, we can also imagine that we have tamper-proof hardware. So that could be a hardware wallet, maybe one that is more programmable. So imagine like a cold card or something like that, where you would put some of the restriction on the hardware itself to kind of emulate having this third party checking for you for your rules to be okay. What we don't have, again, is covenants. So what is a covenant? To explain you what Bitcoin can do today, we have the outputs in every transaction, and the output defines how the funds can then be spent. So the output has conditions on how the next person or the next spending will be able to spend them, but that's only from the input. So you cannot have a restriction on the output of the child transaction, meaning that if I send Bitcoin to Michael, I can put some restriction on this. I could say, Michael will not be able to spend this transaction before the 1st of December through a time lock. I could do that. Or I will send these coins to Michael, but I also need to co-sign. I need a multisig with him. But what I cannot do is put a restriction on how the output of this spending transaction will be. So I cannot say that the coins I'm sending to Michael can only go to Kraken afterwards. There is no way of doing that today. And that's what we call a covenant. So we do not have covenants on Bitcoin today. There are a lot of proposals, and I think Antoine is going to talk about them later. And also the meetup we had last week about check template verify is one of those. So with check template verify, you can enforce a restriction on the output of a child transaction. But today we don't have that in Bitcoin. So Revault is not using this covenant thing. We are trying to emulate it with the tools we have today. So the time locks we have, in Bitcoin, you have 4 of them. You have the lock time and the sequence that you can do at the time of crafting a transaction. So when you are spending a transaction, you can add a lock time or add a sequence. The lock time is about putting a date on time in blocks, but let's say a date, so 1st of December. And this transaction will not be able to be mined before this date is reached. So this is pretty cool. For example, if you want to, well, I will talk about that later. Sequence is relative. So sequence is about how long ago was the parent you're spending, the UTXO you're spending from, how long it was mined ago. So if you sign a transaction with a sequence of like 1 week, it means that you need to wait 1 week before the UTXO you're spending from has been mined. So it's just a delay between the UTXO you're using and the transaction you're spending from. So these two are interesting when you are creating the transactions. But sometimes they're not enough, because if you have the private key, you can just double spend them. You can do another transaction spending the same output and remove the lock time from your own transaction. So you can double spend your thing. So it's not really a restriction. It's just somewhat restrictive, but you can bypass it if you want. So an attacker having your keys doesn't care about your lock time and sequence. So that's why these two opcodes, opcLTV and opcsv, were created. So check lock time verify and check sequence verify. This is put on the outputs of a transaction, and that forces the one that will use this output later, so the child transaction, to have a lock time or a sequence that correspond to whatever is restricted here. So that means that I could have a deposit address where when I send funds to it, it enforces a delay of like 3 hours before I can spend them again, using a CSV, for example. And this is cool. Now we're starting to talk about interesting things that we can use in weird Vault designs, and I will cover that later. But I just wanted to show you the different time locks we have, and maybe you can start thinking about how we can use these together to build some of the restriction we were trying to do earlier. And also another thing, just as a note here, Bitcoin doesn't have an idea of time, or at least it's not clear. So you can do time from a transaction was mined because mining is consensus, but you cannot do time since a transaction has been seen in the mempool because the mempool is not consensual. At least not everybody has the same mempool. So we cannot do something like time lock from the time of signing, which is somewhat annoying because we would like that in Vault systems. For example, if we had something that let me have a time from like a lock on from the time of signing, I could say, okay, I can sign a transaction, but I know that while signing it, I need to wait 1 day before it can be mined. This is not possible today. So that's kind of annoying, and we have to play around that. What do I have here? Oh, yeah. The title is probably not right. I wanted to start talking about how we can do advanced mitigation. So some things we're not using today to force restriction to kind of emulate this restriction, where, how, and when. So the most basic one you can do is adding annoying processes. So for example, you have a 2 out of 2 and you put one of these 2 keys in a bank vault. That's for sure. Now you cannot spending during the night because the banks are closed at night. So that's kind of enabling your covenant on when you can spend from it. You can also have a notary that will make sure that the key you are spending to is actually one of your whitelist keys. So this is cool, but it creates other problems. What if the bank, loses your vault or whatever? What if the notary cheats or doesn't want to sign any transaction? So again, that's one tool we could use, but it's not great. Then we have time locks, as we just talked about. And time locks are more interesting in terms of vaults, or at least covenants you can do on yourself. So if you put a deposit to an OpsCLTV, check lock time verify, saying 1st of December, you know that you cannot, even if you try, you cannot spend this transaction or this output before the 1st of December now. So this is great if you really know you don't want to be able to spend your funds before a certain amount of time or before a certain date. So if you want to hold, or if you want to do a gift to somebody and you tell them, hey, you can't use it before you're 18 years old, you could enforce that in the Bitcoin transaction itself. So that's starting to be interesting now. OpsCSV is the same thing, but from the time the deposit was made. So it's maybe a little bit more flexible because you could just say, like, I'm going to do some dollar averaging cost averaging on Bitcoin, and every time I purchase Bitcoin, I want to be only able to spend them in 2 years. So every time you do a transaction, it will move forward 2 years for this specific output. Again, this is cool, but even you cannot spend from it. So it's not only against an attacker; it's a real covenant that nobody can spend from these funds before the date has been reached. Then we have key deletion. Okay, that's more interesting now. We are starting to be in the ideas that are not really obvious, right? This has been proposed a lot of time, many times on Bitcoin, so it's not new, but it's not something you would think of just like that while looking at Bitcoin and what you can do with transactions. Key deletion is a great way to enforce that something will happen. You can sign a transaction from, let's say, a deposit UTXO, so you receive some money. You can sign a transaction spending from it, and then you delete the private key. So you are not broadcasting the transaction yet. You're just signing it, and you keep it, and you delete the private key. That means that nobody, not even you, now can move these funds in another way than the way you already signed and kept in your backup or whatever, because you don't have the private key to change this. So this is a way of creating a covenant where you could choose, how much is moving, where it's moving. You can put time locks if you want. You can do a lot of things. Now, the major risk you have here, again, is that you don't have the private key. So if anything is wrong with it, it's too late. Or even if you lose this pre-signed transaction because you don't have a private key now, the funds are gone. So it's a risky one, but you can try to play around and make cool things. Then you can have a cosigner. So a cosigner can take different forms. It could be a secure hardware where you enforce checking the rules, maybe checking a whitelist or whatever. But it could also be a third party if you want to use like Casa or BitGo or whatever. So in that case, you would do maybe a 2 out of 2, and you would need a cosigner to approve every transaction you do. So you sign your transaction first, you send them to the cosigner. If the spending conditions are not met, maybe you overreached, you spent too much this month, then it's not supposed to sign. So this is another thing that could be fun. You can automate things, you can build it at home, and if you know it's secure hardware and it's not easy to modify, that could be a good way to ensure that your transactions are not completely unchecked, or at least yeah, too easy to spend. And now let's go to the fun stuff. All right, so this is an idea that is coming back to 2013, I guess, which is what we call the clawback. This is also where the name Revault comes from. It's about sending back a transaction to a vault. So doing this is quite interesting, but it looks quite heavy, so I'm going to try to explain this. So you start with a transaction, let's call it the vaulting transaction, where you have an output in this that you will use to be spent with a pre-signed transaction that has 2 different exit points. Either you use your hot wallet key, like any hot wallet, right, on your phone, plus a check sequence verify, maybe of a few hours or a few days, let's say a few hours. And the other way of spending from it is to use the clawback transaction that is sending this again into a vault. And the key is deleted here. So now what it means is that we're back to the key deletion slide that I had before, meaning that this vault transaction can only be spent by this transaction because we deleted the private key. So then if you want to actually use the funds, either you use your hot wallet key and you have to wait for the delay of the CSV, or you can also trigger a clawback, which instantly, without the delay, can put these funds back into a vault transaction. So doing back the same protection or sending them to a different set of keys, no matter what, you can choose this at the time of crafting your clawback. Again, because the clawback doesn't have the OP-CSV here, you also need to delete the key for signing this clawback. So you have to delete the keys for the unvaulting transaction, and you have to delete the key for the clawback transaction. What else can I say about this? Yes, so as you might see here, you don't have to do it this way, but the good way of doing it is that the clawback itself is also a vaulting transaction. So you're doing some kind of a loop here where you need to also have deleted the keys of the unvaulting following. So the unvaulting at the bottom here, you need to have deleted these keys, but that means that you also need another clawback like here, but coming from here, that also needs to be deleted, etc., etc. So to build such a transaction, you can do that with SegWit, because now we have more stability in the TXID. But the problem is that you have to, well, you should already pre-sign and delete all your keys before doing the very first transaction in it. And that is interesting. In this type of vaults, because the amount would change the TXID, you have to know the exact amount before you're able to craft the transaction here, sign it, and delete the key. Same here. You need to know the amount you're spending from, because otherwise the TXID would change. So when you do such a vault with the clawback, you need to know how much money you're receiving in it. If somebody uses the address that you would have in the output here of the vaulting transaction, if somebody reuses this address and sends no matter what amount of funds, the TXID would have changed. So you would have no way of spending from it because the private key has been deleted. So it works, but you have to be extremely careful, because once you deleted your private keys, it's too late. If you do any mistake, it's gone. Another thing is that if you lose the pre-signed transaction, your funds are gone as well. So you need to do backups of all of that. So yeah, that's kind of what Brian Bishop proposed to the mailing list with his implementation quite recently. The first time it was discussed was probably in 2013. Also, Bob McElrath has done a paper on this at some point. I don't remember, like 2015. So yeah, a lot of people have thought about this kind of protection system mechanism, and I think it is pretty cool. Now, we're not using this in Revault, but I think this is right now what, you know, the most advanced thing you can do, although nobody has that in production anywhere. Yeah, anybody has some questions about this slide, maybe?
So a couple of things, Kevin. I think
Yeah.
your the video of yourself is flickering a bit. The slides are perfect, but your image in the corner is flickering. It might be a little bit annoying to the people watching on YouTube.
All right. Do you want me to remove it?
I think that's probably better.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
until we get off the slides, and then you'll go full screen in terms of image of yourself.
Yeah.
And then there's been some conversation on the chat. So I don't know if Bob, I'll give Bob a few seconds in case he wants to come on the call and discuss what he's been talking about on the chat. Are you there, Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just two little points. One is you discussed having the ability to do a time lock from the time of signing. I mean, that's cryptographically possible using time lock puzzles or verifiable delay functions, but I think this is very, very far from anything anybody would actually want to use right now. But you know, for those that are interested in crypto, something to keep an eye on. Secondly, someone asked in the chat, how do you prove the private key was deleted? And in general, you can't. An alternative is to use ECDSA key recovery, but that cannot be used with Bitcoin today because the TX-IDs commit to the pub key, which you don't know at the time you do the key recovery. That's it. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and another thing. So for a single party, it's fine because you can somewhat prove to yourself that you deleted your private key. So yeah, that's the one thing. In multi-party, it's much harder because you cannot prove to somebody else that you deleted your key. All right, let me remove my video and I will share my screen again. Oops.
I will say it's a little bit worse than that. You have some hardware which generated a key and you want it to delete the key, right? And you should ask questions about, did that hardware delete the key? You know, if you're using Linux and, you know, it has a swap file and it has memory paging and things like this key could exist in multiple places. So it's not just that I ran it on my computer. You have to then you get down to the hardware level and, you know, lock the memory and overwrite the memory. And then you can ask questions about things like rowhammer. You know, could I pull that out in some other way? It's very, very hard, if not impossible, to prove you deleted a key, even to yourself.
All right, agreed. Yeah, you could imagine some way you don't have it anymore, but yeah, sure. Let's say this is not easy to do. Okay, so you have my screen, right?
Yes, I can see the slides, Kevin, and it's
Cool.
it's much better without the flickery image in the corner.
Great.
So yeah,
okay, cool.
Go for it.
All right, so now let's talk a little bit about institutional mitigation, which is a little bit different because usually it's multi-party. Also, the impact on operations is somewhat important. Of course, it depends on who you're dealing with. But for example, if it's an exchange, they need to access their cold storage quite often, and that defeats the purpose entirely. Like a cold storage should never be used. So yeah, we need to have ways that can be used without breaking the security too much. And this is one of the focus of Revault. Another thing is that with institutions, we have another risk, which is insider risk. Of course, when you're alone, you're not scared of yourself stealing your own Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin is very similar to cash in the sense that if you have a business and you have a till with banknotes in it, it becomes really hard to secure this. And if you want to have normal operations, you need people to be able to take cash within this cash till. But you don't necessarily want every stakeholder in the business to be there with a multi-key thing to open the till every time. So how can we somewhat not have a heavy impact on operations while being able to enforce or at least emulate some enforcement of such thing that a covenant would enable? What else? Yes, also the incentive to attack is higher for businesses because usually businesses have much more money than individuals. So when we're talking about an exchange, we are talking about some exchanges today having cold storage with more than $1 billion worth of Bitcoin behind a single private key. This is insane. And this is what we have today in terms of security. I mean, you would be really surprised how bad security is in Bitcoin today, at least in key management today. Okay, so what most people use today is multisig. Let's say 2 out of 3, so m out of n. So usually you don't have an n out of n, because that would mean that if one party lose their keys, the entire fund is locked. So that is a big problem. Now you have a way of mitigating that with proper backups and things like this. But what you mostly see today in businesses is a multisig m out of n. That can be done in-house, like some exchanges do, or that can be done with a third party like BitGo, for example. And then you also have the cold storage with frequent access, like I just said, which kind of defeat the purpose of the cold storage. So most of these are often delegated to a third party. So you have a lot of businesses today that exist just to provide custody solution for other businesses on Bitcoin, and they charge a lot of money for that. Now, in the end of the day, these custodians also need to secure the keys somehow. So we're back to the same problem. How are they keeping the keys? Is it just a multisig? What size of multisig? Is it just a cold storage? How is it kept? So you always have a problem there. And well, yeah, they would say they have an insurance, but insurance is not really a security solution here. Okay, Revault. Let's start talking about Revault a little bit. How long did I take? Yeah, I need to move forward. Okay, in Revault, we are trying to solve a lot of things at the same time. It started with a hedge fund contacting us, and this hedge fund basically wanted to try to be capable of self-hosting their own custody without impacting their operations. And they also have this interesting thing that they have only a subset of active traders, while the other ones are only the partners in the funds. And they wanted some kind of security that would enable having like the maximum security possible without impacting their operations. So anyways, Revault covers up to n-1 participants being compromised. This is pretty cool. So compared to, for example, a BitGo 2 out of 3, in a 2 out of 3, you cannot sustain n-1 because you only need 2 keys to spend the funds. So Revault is basically still secure until you have every single key being compromised. We also have physical threat mitigation. So if somebody were to come and threaten all the participants in our scheme at the same time, we still have things to partially protect the funds. A small part of it could be stolen, but we still have partial mitigation, even with n keys being compromised, which is quite interesting, I think. We also have a very low operational overhead. I will show you how, but basically in Revault, it's kind of like it's approved by default. Every spending is approved by default, but can be canceled instead of having to ask agreement every time to all the stakeholders. There is a bypass possible in case of emergency. So that means, for example, you see the price of Bitcoin, I don't know, mooning or crashing, and you need to move the funds right now, and you don't want to enforce the time locks we have, that would be a few hours. If all the participants want to, and they are not under threat, then they can move the funds without being encumbered by the time locks we have, which is something very interesting for a hedge fund, for example. Then we have the panic button that sends the fund in what we call the emergency deep vault. As you will see later in the slides, the emergency deep vault is basically a different address that is more secure than the most secure address we have in our vault system. So in our case, we have n out of n. The emergency deep vault should be harder than that to spend. So that could be n out of n plus a long time lock, separate the keys separated in different geographical location. It could be n being bigger than the original n, a lot of things like that. So this is a way to escape the architecture if anything go wrong. Yeah, to even avoid sending back the funds to a vault, it goes to a completely different security solution. And also another thing different from other models and other proposals out there is that the funds are secure from the time of deposit in Revault. We don't have an intermediary wallet that needs to put the funds in the vault. For us, deposit equal secure. So the deposit is a 4 out of 4 or whatever, n out of n, as you will see. Yeah, I know it's a lot. I will come back to this later. Institutional, yeah, okay, not covered. We are not covering an insider locking the funds, so refusing to sign. This is something that is possible, and if they don't sign, well, the funds cannot move. That's fair. The only way to bypass that, to bypass somebody not signing, would mean that we cannot have the n-1 participant compromise here, because maybe the one not signing is the only guy that is not compromised. So we cannot bypass that. We have partial mitigation, though. That doesn't mean the funds would be locked forever. It's only a small amount or a limited amount of the funds that would be locked. And then a little bit harder would be an insider burning funds. So deleting their private key and deleting all backups of their private key and deleting the emergency backup, the emergency deep vault keys. It could happen. If somebody go really mad, they could delete every single keys and backup of keys they have. So depending on how the vault is designed, yeah, the funds might be lost forever. So this is something to have in mind when deploying such an architecture. Okay, this is a graph that we have of what it looks like. I will try to explain it slowly. I know it's a lot. It's quite heavy. So yeah, I'll do my best. So we have deposit transactions that basically create outputs, and these outputs are already vaults. As I said here, the funds are secure from the time of deposit. So these deposits, let's say you are getting money from an exchange, or somebody, a client or whatever, is sending you money, the address you are giving them is already encumbered by a 4 out of 4, n out of n multisig. So that would be what we call the vault UTXO. To spend from this UTXO, you would need a transaction that we call the vault transaction, or you would need the n participant. I keep saying 4 because in the demo we use 4, but I'm trying to generalize now. So in the n participants agreeing and sending the funds out of the vault. So that is what I called the bypass before. So if really there is a operational emergency where the funds really need to move right now without a time lock, sure, the n participant can use it and spend the funds. That would not be possible if we had key deletion, but we do not have key deletion right now in Revault. So when you have a deposit, so when you receive funds in a vault, now we need the participants, the n people, to pre-sign a set of transactions. So typically they would do that, let's say once a day in the morning, they come to the office, and every one of these n participants in his routine would have to check if there have been any deposit, and if there have been, then he should pre-sign the transaction for that. So the transaction to be pre-signed are the 2 emergency transactions, one from the vault directly, and one from the transaction that will spend from the vault. And also he needs to sign a cancel transaction, which is a transaction that spends from the unvaulting transaction and send it back to a vault. I know it's quite weird. If you've never seen vaults before, this is now quite common. It's a clawback. But if you've never seen something like that before, I know it's kind of weird. So we are pre-signing these 3 transactions, the 2 red ones and the orange one. And after that, we sign the blue one here, the unvaulting transaction. And then we keep these 4 pre-signed transactions somewhere safe. If somebody wants to spend funds, so let's say the traders or whoever is authorized, the finance guy in your company, whoever is authorized to spend funds, he just craft a normal transaction that we call the spend transaction. But this transaction is actually time locked because it can only spend from the output of the unvault, which enforce a time lock for this. And so the only difference in operations is that when the person authorized to spend is doing his transaction, he will have to wait a few blocks. It's defined before to have his transaction mined. All right. And in the meantime, so during this time lock, we can have a watchtower or one of the participants triggering a revault transaction. So a transaction coming back to a vault, or an emergency transaction sending all the funds to the emergency deep vault, the thing that is out of the architecture if really something goes wrong. So just to clarify a little bit what it looks like, these vaults are encumbered by n out of n. So you need all the participants to sign to move them. And this is what we use to actually pre-sign the transaction, because they use this path. So the emergency that goes down here is pre-signed with these 4 keys, or n keys, sorry. This unvaulting transaction is pre-signed with these 4 keys. And then this unvaulting transaction also looks like that. It is pre-signed and it has 2 conditions, either m out of n. M can be anything from 1 to n. So that's the authorized people. Then you have co-signing servers that Antoine will talk about, which are just to fix a specific attack against our architecture, and the OPCSV that enforce the time lock. So either we have this subset of authorized people that also need to wait a time lock, or we have all the participants agreeing. This n out of n is not really to be used by people. It's just to trigger the pre-signed cancelled and unvault transaction that are using these 4 or n signatures, sorry. All right, so I think that's as far as I can go in explaining this. Yeah, and lastly, the emergency deep vault here in the bottom. The conditions to spend from it are just strictly harder than n out of n. This is the only condition we have. The obscurity in this is actually important. An attacker from the outside trying to steal your money while scheduling all of his attack, it's already pretty hard to steal money from this. But if on top of it, it doesn't have any idea of how hard the EDV is to spend from, maybe it requires even more people than the n participants. This is a very strong deterrent against an attack. All right, and now I'm gonna go quickly. Yeah, okay. So just, this looks very complicated, but most of it is automated, right? You don't have to manually do all of this. The process looks like this. You receive a deposit. This is already protected behind n out of n, so you're fine. Even if you don't sign it, it's okay. Nobody can steal these funds. At some point, all stakeholders will need to pre-sign the emergency, cancel transaction, unvaulting transaction. So that would be done maybe every morning. And that just makes the funds now spendable. It's like confirming that they have been deposited. And from this list of UTXO that have been pre-signed now, any authorized person can create a spending transaction. It looks like a normal transaction. They can spend it wherever they want. It's just that they will have a time lock that will let the people, any of the end stakeholders or watchtowers they control, in case there is something wrong with the spending transaction, it will let them cancel or emergency default the transaction. So that's basically what the process looked like. Funds are deposited, nobody can spend them until all stakeholders have seen it. And then once they have been pre-signed, it just looks like a normal wallet that has a time lock on top of it for the spender to be able to spend. So it's cool for multiple reasons. It's cool because we don't need to know any amounts in advance. There is no deletion of private key here. So we can reuse addresses if like it happens. It's not a problem. We can, well, yeah, pretty much anything is possible. So this is really cool. It doesn't prevent us from receiving deposits, even if there is no pre-signed transaction made in advance. So this is different from any of the key deletion proposals, because you would need to pre-sign the whole tree before depositing money in it. And you would need to put the exact amount that was, well, at least you would lose the amount that is not, no, yeah, you would need to put the exact amount as a deposit, because that would be the TXID changing otherwise. So we don't have this problem. We can backup seeds. We don't have to backup transactions as such. Even if one of our pre-signed transaction is lost, we can still re-sign it with the keys. So the backups we need are only seeds for these different private keys. We don't delete private keys, so that's pretty easy to safekeep today. While the proposal with the key deletion would have to have a backup every time they pre-sign a transaction. Otherwise, losing the pre-signed transaction is losing the funds. Day-to-day operations are only impacted by a delay. So that's what I just said before. The only difference for the normal person to use this architecture is that the funds are not going to be confirmed before X amount of blocks. We're trying to reach the security level of n out of n, although only a subset of this would be the person creating the spending transaction. So to emulate that everybody is still agreeing, we have watchtowers and things like this. Antoine will cover that later. And also we have the extra emergency deep vault in case a lot of these keys are compromised. We can still move all the funds outside. And lastly, it's open source, which is pretty cool, I think. And there is no third-party risk because there is no third party. Everything should be self-hosted. If you want to deal with third parties, it's only to add security on top, like using watchtowers. All right, I think. Yeah, Antoine is complaining because I keep saying Antoine is going to talk about that. Okay, I think that's my part. Do you have any question on maybe this or on anything else?
Yes, there's a conversation going in the chat. Perhaps we'll go to Bob, and Bob can ask. He's speaking to Antoine at the moment in the chat. Maybe Bob can ask a couple of questions to you, Kevin. Yeah,
he was just clarifying for me where the time locks are. So maybe if you want to just go over that real quickly. So the unvault transaction has a CSV on it, right? Spend transaction has a CSV.
No.
The deposit transactions do not, though, correct?
Only the unvault has a CSV. The spending is only delayed by this op CSV. So yeah, there is the spend transaction is just going out, right? The out is a UTXO, it's not a transaction. So the time lock is actually enforced by the CSV. So the sequence is in the TX, the spend TX.
So the purpose of the time lock on the spend transaction, I think, should have been to send that spend transaction back to the emergency vault. But there's no second branch there on the spend transaction.
Yes. Okay. Do I have a... So for us, the spend transaction is exactly like here. All right. So the delay is between the unvaulting and the spending. So the clawback happens at the time of the unvaulting being published. The reason for that, oh yeah, okay, I understand now your point. The reason for that is that we enforce through the cosigning servers that I don't have here in this graph. We enforce that the unvaulting transaction is not pushed if the cosigners have not seen a spend transaction child before. So that means that we kind of emulate that the distance between these two transactions is op CSV, because if an unvault transaction has been mined without the participant knowing about the spending transaction that will spend from it, then we trigger automatically a cancel transaction. So it's just to enforce that we have the full delay to cancel the spending if needed.
Okay, sounds good. So the what I would have called the receiving wallet on the left, the deposit transactions, this is a standard N of N wallet, right? There's no time locks there, no scripts. It's a standard wallet. Okay. Yeah, so I believe in our paper we call this a quote unquote receiving wallet because everything else that's happening here is part of a protocol. And you know, people need to know, the participants need to know like what are the steps and what are the what's going on there. And in order to start the protocol, you have to have full control. You know, you can't expect someone to deposit into a time-locked, vaulted, scripted transaction very easily. And yeah, so what you've done allows you to construct the unvault transactions in the way that you want. And there are interesting properties here. You know, you can, those unvault transactions can be, for instance, tranched. You know, let's say you want to make 10 Bitcoin tranches, right, for different traders or something like that.
Yeah. We could. So in our design, although I don't really remember what yours is made of, I think it's the same at the beginning. So we consider that, you know, each vault is a completely different thing, different UTXO, different address, different everything. But yes, we could branch out in the unvault otherwise. I don't think it's something we really want to do because we can have, you know, change going back to a vault or anything if needed. But we're not enforcing, at least at the script level here, we're not enforcing amounts. We let that to watchtowers looking at the protocol or even the cosigners if they have some restriction on the cosigning.
Yeah, if I may add something, Bob, this is the whole point of using the cosigning servers is just to leave the maximum flexibility to the spend transactions, to not have to commit to the amounts, neither to commit to the addresses. for the spend transaction so that it can even have change, so we don't even have to change the Unvault transaction.
Good idea. By the way, I don't know if it's later in your talk, but I would love to hear about how you handle change, CPFP, RBF, mempool pinning, how you handle
Yeah,
that.
it's all coming right after.
Cool.
And yeah, just a last thing I wanted to say about what you said. So yes, the first one, N of N here, is a normal N of N. There is no other restriction on it. But we consider this to be like the highest level of security in the architecture, because the N is not the normal amount of people required to spend the money. So the spend transaction here would usually be M of N. So the N of N, sorry, is just like a lot of people, much more than would be used in a normal multi-signature, because they don't have to do any special work. It's just like in the morning, they have this deposit process happening and they just need to pre-sign the things. So yeah, I don't know if it's clear. What I'm trying to say is that a normal company using a normal multisig for this would be using M of N for the spenders, right? So we're just trying to add new signatures on top, going back to N, even if they are not part of the usual spending people. It's like increasing the security to a bigger multisig.
So N of N doesn't allow for any redundancy. Have your clients been happy with that, or do they want to insert a threshold there in the first step? What do people think of that?
The N of N doesn't have redundancy here, no, because they should have proper backups and key management in place. In the M of N, for the spending, our actually original client asked for having this M being actually it's a M of not N of something else. They wanted to have a subset of traders, and only 2 out of 3 traders should be required to spend the money, just in case one of them is unavailable or something like that. So yeah, we have done more complex than this generalization.
Thank you.
All right, Antoine.
Cool. So just before we go over to Antoine, there's a question on the YouTube. Fox Roman asks, which exchanges are best? So this is referring to one of your earlier comments about the exchanges, like cold storage setups, not being great at the moment. Like, do you have any insight into what those setups actually are, Kevin? Because obviously they're shrouded in secrecy, because there's
secrecy
hundreds of millions or billions.
Secrecy is a very big part of it. And also it's very hard to know, even if it's a single key securing your funds, it's really hard to know, again, it's back to my slides, my very early slide on control. So yeah, it could be just a single key, but you don't know how it's secure. It could be secure in a HSM, so a hardware security model, where nobody can extract the key. So having a single key is not necessarily a bad thing if it's properly secured. Relatively, you can go to the other extreme, being like, hey, I'm a company and I'm using BitGo, meaning I have a 2 out of 3, I am very secure. Not really, because you have 2 out of the 3 signature yourself, because you have your normal key and you have your backup key in case BitGo goes offline, for example. Then in that case, that means you are a single point of failure. Anybody can come to you and get these 2 keys quite easily. So it's really hard to say, that more keys is more secure. It really depends on how you manage those keys.
Cool, thank you. Are there any other questions for Kevin specifically on the content he's covered in the chat? And sorry, on the call. Otherwise, you can ask. Wait a second. No, I don't think. Okay, so I'm not saying anything. So Kevin and Antoine will both answer questions at the end. But so yeah, let's move on to Antoine's section, shall we, Kevin?
Yeah, so I'm gonna stop sharing and Antoine will take over.
Okay, cool. If you have any problems, Antoine,
no,
let us know.
Yeah, Zoom is telling me that the host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay. Maybe
I will make you co-host, Antoine. So I've just done that now.
Great. Okay. So I hope there is no more questions about the architecture itself, because I just talked about just some fun we had while designing it, some challenges we encountered, and other things really specific, and just not an overall presentations of how it works, but why we end up with this architecture. So the first challenge we encountered is a very common one, which we've been discussing a lot for the Lightning Network, and even more lately. How to get pre-signed transaction to confirm in the timely manner for multi-party contracts. So our security model relies on our revolting transactions to be enforceable at any time. We need to find a way for transactions to pay enough fees according to the fee markets, no matter when we want to broadcast them. Yeah, by the way, I make some pause, as you said, Michael, but if someone wants to interrupt me, or if I'm not really understandable, I can just repeat. So we could use something like the update fee message currently used in the Lightning Network protocol, which kindly ask our peer to sign a new commitment transaction with us as the current fee rate increases, or another new one when the fee rate decreases. But we can't trust the other parties to sign the transaction. Firstly, because they might be part of the attacks. Like with Vault, we're taking bid money, so they have a strong incentive to just take the Vault money into their pocket and act badly and just refuse to sign a revolting transaction. Secondly, because even if they're honest, it would require for an attackant to just compromise one party to prevent a revolting transaction to be executed. And finally, because they may not even be able to sign it in the first place, they may not have their HSM available, and in addition, that would require them to draw their HSM each time there is a fee rate bump, etc. So that's just not practical. So we were left with either using anchor outputs, what has been planned for the Lightning Network, or letting each party attach inputs to the transactions, aka bring your own fees. So we went for the second one, and at first we leveraged the fact that our revolting transactions, so I've put cancel transactions, but just the same for all the emergency transactions, just have one input and one output, and we use the SIGASH single safely, because if there is a difference between the number, we may encounter the bug, the SIGASH single bug. So this allowed any party to just bump the fee rate by adding input and output to the transaction, or if the transaction already have enough fees at the time of broadcast, just replace a single anyone can pay signature by a SIGASH or signature before broadcasting. But unfortunately, this opened up a possibility for transaction pinning, as we would allow any stakeholder to just attach a new output paying to themselves, and this they will both allow them to decrease the cancel transaction fee rate, while we want them to add a big input and a low output. They could just add a high output and a low input to just take all the fees of the transaction and just keep it just above the minimum relay fees. And they could also just pin the transaction in the mempool as the output is just paying to themselves according to BIP 125 rules. So we went finally for
Sorry, Antoine, very quickly. It's not a big deal, but you haven't gone full screen on the slides. so we can see all the slides on the left side. I don't know if you want to do a slideshow or if you want to stick with this.
I want to, yeah, I wanted to stick with this. Can you just see the diagrams? Or
yeah, we can see it.
Zoom?
Yeah, I think it's fine. I just wanted you to know, just in case you wanted to do the screen share. Okay, sorry for interrupting. Continue.
Okay, so we went for SIGASH all anyone can pay signatures to be exchanged between stakeholders finally, because they would commit to all the outputs, and thus will not allow any party to add an output paying only to themselves. So they cannot anymore pin the revolting transaction itself in the mempool, or neither they can decrease the transaction fee. So this also adds a burden on the fee bumper, because they need to create first stage transactions if the input is too big and they want to change outputs in the first place. So they need the fee bump transactions to attach as inputs of the revolting transaction. The worst case here is that the fee bump transactions can still be pinned by this change outputs from an attacker, and by the rule, the second rule of the RBF BIP, the unconfirmed input would not be replaced in the revolting transaction. And even in this worst case scenario, the party bumping the fee rate would could create either a high fee rate fee bump transactions, wait for it to be confirmed in the next 2 blocks, and which is reasonable, as we can expect the Envolt transaction to have a CSV of, I don't know, 15 at least, and and so it will be confirmed, and then the second rule will not apply anymore. I've described it more in details on my mailing list post. Yeah, so I think I'll make a first pause if there is questions.
Are there any questions from the people in the chat? Okay, continue, Anton.
Okay, so then we, as Revolt is very customizable, we wanted to study the maximum number of participants for all the transactions to still be standard. So the response is, of course, it depends, because it depends mainly on the involved script, as it's very customizable, and the policy can be really different depending on the use case of everyone, of each user. So for the Revolt script, the best one I could came with is this one, which would allow 100 participants before hitting the max standard script size for the P2 witness script hash, which is this limit is a standardness limit on the script, which is hashed in the witness program version 0 in pay2WSH. So yeah, it's applied in the input when you want to spend the pay2WSH. Then for the involved script, as there are too much combinations, I arbitrarily took the number of subset members, the M, let's call them the traders, to be half of the number of the participants overall. So with such a script, which ensures that the co-signing servers for the N parties that don't sign the transactions still sign, the maximum number I could come with was 68, and once again I ate the max the same limit, but with other combinations we could also hit a limit on the number of push up record. Then on the Unchained footprints, I had a script which would make rough approximation about how much would it cost to use the architecture. So if I remember correctly, it was about 1,000 weight units for three traders and 6 overall participants. So that's quite reasonable. Unfortunately, I don't have a graphic of all the values, but it's on the GitHub on another branch. Then there is the cosigning servers. So the cosigning servers are, in my opinion, one of the biggest trade-offs of the architecture. They are trusted oracle, and so you need one for each party not signing the spend transaction. Otherwise, this party are just trusting the member of the subset managing the funds or the other cosigning servers. So it's costly and it's online. It's costly because it adds signatures. But it's worth mentioning that even in the worst case scenario in which all cosigning servers are compromised and all the M parties managing the funds are compromised, the spending transactions, this still allows a race because the spending transactions is forced to signal for RBF because of the CSV. So the big question was how to get rid of them. So we thought of them a way to eliminate the cosigning servers without the obvious one, which is M equals M, like all the participants are day-to-day managers, so you don't need cosigning servers. Otherwise, you can pre-sign spend transactions, but you can't always because you need the sets of addressed to exist, to be known in advance, and to be small in-house. And for each for each destination, you need to know the set of amount you want to send to each destination in advance, and to be large enough. So that's really not practical in general, but still can be applied in specific cases. We thought about covenants in the Revault transaction so that it can only be spent by spending transaction, but in any way it's spent by a spend transaction, but all covenants will commit to the amount and destination. So either with check template verify or Sigash no input, it would commit to the amount in the Unvault output. So at the time of signing, so it would commit in advance, and that's just not practical. We thought about key deletion, but obviously you can't prove, and we just talked about it. You can't prove that you effectively deleted keys. We thought about covenant. So we can use covenant like check template verifies, for example, to have the vault transaction commit to the unvault transactions. And just like I talked in the chat with Bob, this would really be a vault, as the vault output could just be spent by an unvault transaction and could not be bypassed anymore. Maybe Kevin could argue that's not a feature because sometimes it's just nice to have the multi-sig and be able to bypass the architecture, but still it's more it's a bit more secure. But unfortunately, nothing less, as we can't use check template verifies to get rid of the cosigning servers. For Sigash no input covenants, that's the same. So yeah, I didn't explicit it in the last slide, but to have a covenant with Sigash no inputs, there is a nice scheme in which you just pay to a signature. So like you would just pay to a signatures in the Unvault script, which is a signatures. No, you would pay in the Vault script, like the address you give to someone to receive funds. Is actually a pay to witness script hash, which is paying to a signatures, which is only valid for an Unvault transactions, and not exactly for an Unvault transactions, but since this is a no input sig hash, only the outputs of the transactions will be hashed. So it actually forces the output, this transaction spending the vault transactions, the deposit transaction, to specify an output such as the unvault. So it's really nice. It's more flexible than checksum plate verify, a little bit less efficient, but it's the same principle. Like checksum plate verifies could be used for the vault transaction, but not for the spend transactions, and it would not be able to eliminate the need for cosigning servers. And for both checksum plate verifies and no input covenant, we need a new step at setup, because we can't expose addresses with covenants such as checksum plate verifies to the public, because address will be reused no matter what we can hope. And if they're already used with an amount less than the previous one for checksum plate verified, or even for the SIGASH no input covenant, the Bitcoin would just be lost. And if it's reused, if a higher amount, all the Bitcoins in addition will go to the fees. The Bitcoins at the top more than the amount. Then we also talked about key deletion, and mainly when we started talking with Jacob Sambo, who was working on vaults, and with I think Bob. So we talked about key deletion, and Kevin was interested in on Brian Bishop architecture, which uses key deletions, but it isn't provable to the other parties. But you don't care if the output pays to n of n multisig. And that's something Jacob came up with once when we were talking with him. And that's really true that if this is for n of n output, like the Vault script, if you just delete your key, you know that it won't be spendable anymore. So the pre-signed transactions, the already pre-signed transactions, are effectively covenant. So it's possible to apply to Revault, but unfortunately, it has a lot of complexity and a setup phase. Like, for example, you can't have a control transaction anymore, or you have to sign a lot of rounds of pre-signed transaction set, because the obvious way would be to, if the keys for the vault outputs are deleted, and the only way to spend from the vault is the in-vault transaction, the obvious way would be to have the stakeholder broadcast in vault, have it cancelled, and just boom, a new output with non-deleted keys just appeared. So to resolve this, you could have deleted these keys and created the signatures for all the next transactions, but this requires a lot of rounds and it adds complexity. And in addition, we want it to be really practical, and we are not convinced of the feasibility of having key deletion in a secure protocol for a practical protocol. Finally, Revolt and the state of the current proposals for Bitcoin. So not only the protocol in itself. So there is, for the protocol, there is checksum plate verifies and no input and friends, any prove out, etc. This is cool. Like, you can do covenant without key deletion. This is less costly to do those covenants. But it's not required and at all for Revolts. There is also BIP taproot and BIP tapscript, which would bring a strong cost optimization and would hide the cancel transaction path because it's a 4 out of 4. But unfortunately, not the spend path, because the spend is not committed to is not pre-signed, so you have to enforce the log time in the vault output script, the unvault output script, and then it has to be revealed in order to spend from the unvault. But we are more interested in an more eager to see the efforts in reducing mining centralization, such as Stratum version 2, because it's at the root of all our security assumptions to have a revolting transactions that just confirms. That's why we have complicated schemes for paying enough fees, but if we need to account for miners as attackers in our architecture, so we need to account for miner censorships, and if it's true centralized, it can effectively be censored. Yeah, and to finish this, I want to, is Revolt good? Because it's really simple in appearance, and that's the goal, I think, because it's really designed for practical use and for people using Bitcoin 2 days to use something more secure, so that it's not good, but it's just better that what is used today. Like, for example, it would allow what Kevin told just now, to have higher threshold multisig at the root of the architecture for the Vault scripts, while because without the flexibility, without all this cosigning server stuff, we wouldn't have this flexibility, and thus we would have lower threshold multisig at the root, because so some stakeholders don't want to have the burden of signing all pending transactions. And I think that's the end.
Cool, thank you, Antoine. There's some conversation in the chat. Yeah, should we go back to Bob again?
Hey, okay, since you mentioned no input, there is a way to do deleted keys in a safe way if you have no input, and that's by using ECDSA key recovery. Basically, the idea is what you do is you generate the signature first, and from that you compute the pub key. And you can only do that if you have no input. So there is a mechanism there that could be used with no input. So this is how you prove that you deleted a key. Coming back to the previous conversation, is you basically provide a hash preimage of the signature itself as a binary string. This is now like a nothing up my sleeve signature. And unless I can break the hash function or break the elliptic curve discrete log problem, I could not have generated that signature even if I had the private key. However, this doesn't work. The no input / any prevout proposal puts the any prevout in a taproot script. This additionally commits to the pub key at the signing time. So as the proposals stand now, this won't work. But if you do have no input, generally there is a way to prove you deleted keys.
Okay, so that's very interesting, actually, because I have to say I've thought a lot about how to make this the spenders commit to the amount in the address at spending times, and that was one, but this would create a cyclic hash.
Yep, that's exactly the problem. It creates a cyclic hash. That's why you need no input, because the cyclicity comes from the TXID on the input, which the TXID commits to the addresses on the previous output, which are functions of the pub key. So that's why it doesn't work.
Okay, Anton and Kevin, if you're happy, put the videos on, so people can see you when we ask you questions. Any other questions? I don't think there's any more questions on YouTube at the moment. Any other questions for people in the chat? On the call, sorry? Not seeing any hands. I'll ask about, there was a message. Okay, so I think Kevin said that if you were to set up a watchtower for this Revault design, the watchtower would potentially be broadcasting either a Revault transaction or an emergency transaction. Is that right? And
It is right, but it's being discussed because I don't agree with Antoine on this. In my vision, the Watchtower should only broadcast the revolting transaction, and they should not have an emergency transaction. My standpoint for that is that the emergency transaction is such a burden. And also in our architecture, we assume that if one emergency transaction is broadcast, then all the other ones should also be broadcast. So all the funds within the architecture should move at the same time to the emergency deep vault wallet. So to me, that is a problem because the watchtowers should be trustless. Now we have this problem that if somebody starts triggering one emergency transaction, it completely, break the system, at least for a few weeks or for a few months. I don't know how difficult it would be to recover the emergency deep vault. But that would be a massive denial of service type attack. If any of the emergency deep vault or the emergency transaction can be stolen, because then, yeah, you kind of force everybody to go dig their emergency keys. You need to wait how long the time locks are. So it could be a very strong attack against us if an emergency transaction is out in the wild. While the cancel transaction is not really a problem. It just go back to a vault and the next step is just to unvault it. So it's fine.
And my point on this, so we argue, but it's okay, and we'll agree later. But my point on this is that what Revault differs from a normal multisig and multisig is that there is the emergency transaction, which is a significant deterrent against threats. And to keep this deterrence, you need to have all the parties to have, including the external watchtowers, to be able to broadcast the emergency. Because we can think of a lot of things, but the network watchers of each stakeholders might be known, while the external watchtowers might not be. So it always keeps this threat button threats on the attackers so that his attacks won't succeed.
Okay, cool. And I'm assuming you haven't built out like a prototype watchtower for this design, like because you're still finalizing exactly what the watchtower would need to broadcast to look out for, right?
Yeah, we don't agree yet, but we don't have an implementation either. We just add a demo. In the demo, it's just the network watchers, which is, by the way, the same as the wallet of each one, because it was just a proof of concept for running functional tests. So no.
And I think Brian said last week in the Scratic that he was in the same boat. He hadn't really thought about the watchtower component.
On the topic of the watchtower, I'd like to add something that maybe wasn't explained clearly. So yeah, the unvaulting transaction, so the one coming after the vault, should not be broadcast before the participants or the cosigners have seen the spending transaction first. So first we need to know where the funds are going, and then we're releasing the parent for the spending transaction. So that's also part of the job of the watchtowers. If they see on the network, on Bitcoin, if they see that there is an unvaulting transaction being mined, but they are not aware of what the spending transaction look like, this might be an attack. Because if we don't know where the spending transaction is going to, then we should trigger a revaulting, a cancel transaction. So part of the job of the watchtowers is also just to look at the network and see that if there is an unvaulting that is broadcast without knowing where the spending transaction is going to bring the funds, then automatically we should trigger a revaulting transaction just by default. It's not too heavy on the process because there is no time lock in there. So it's going back to the vault and we just need to pre-sign the unvaulting again. So that could be done in one block if needed. But the protection it brings is really, really high. And so the role of the cosigner, again, like Antoine said, is that we have an attack that is possible That was also possible in the original design that Brian published, which is that if we have, so even assuming that we know where the spending transaction is going to go, so the unvaulting transaction is mined, we are lapsing the time, the whatever blocks CSV, but at the exact block where we lapse the CSV, then there could be a race condition between the spending transaction and an attacker spending transaction if he has all the keys. So all the M of N keys. So that's why we needed to add the cosigners. We wanted a very dumb server, automated server, that sign only once per UTXOs, that just avoid having a double spending at the exact time of expiration of the lock time. So yeah, that's why we added the cosigning server. And the solution that Brian has is actually deleting the keys and then also putting a maximum amount, a percentage of your funds that you can only spend at each cycle. So for us, it's a little bit different. It's a different compromise. And so, yeah, as of today, we haven't really found an alternative to cosigning servers, sadly, but they do serve a real purpose.
Cool, thank you. And then another question, I saw some very big numbers in terms of like multi-sigs. So I'm assuming this is for designs other than your first client where potentially they'd want 50, 60, 70 signers. Like why, it seems weird to me that you'd want to set up a vault with so many signers rather than just like the key board members or etc.
Just something that I measured and so I wanted to talk about, but no, that's maybe someone would want to do this, but no, I don't expect someone to use 68 volts, purchase volts, but why not? They can actually, the question was just that technically they can on Bitcoin to keep and have the transactions be relayed.
Yeah, and it's quite important to look at the modularity of the architecture, because we are pretty much targeting, well, we are targeting institutions, but not two companies have the same requirements. So, from an exchange to a hedge fund to a company like, yours or mine, we have very different need of liquidity. We have very different need of security. Some companies have very few stakeholders and just one guy doing the finances, while when it's about moving a cold storage of a few $1 billion, maybe you want to have actually, a very big set of keys. So yeah, we just wanted to study how big it could get. Not that we want necessarily to implement it that size, but at least we know what are the theoretical limits in it. But even that, it's just a number. And even for that, Antoine had to make some assumptions, as he said in his slide, like he's taking, for example, M of N, M being, half the size of N. That could be anything again, that could be anything between 1 and N. That could even be different participants. So, the size is pretty much irrelevant depending on how many people, cosigning servers, different participants we want to have. So yeah, it's very modular, and we just want to study how big it could get.
Cool, makes sense.
And the reason for that, actually, the reason for that is that the unvaulting transaction, if you remember, you have two branches, and depending on how we implement it, the branch for canceling a transaction is heavier in terms of signatures than the first branch. So if we have less cosigning servers than participants, for example. So let's imagine we only have one person that needs to sign a transaction to spend it, and we only need one cosigning servers. That's going to be 2 signatures. So that's fine, right? It goes through Bitcoin. But what if the transaction we pre-signed for the revaulting or the emergency were like 120 signers? Then this is a non-standard transaction. So we can actually never recover the funds. And that would be quite problematic. So we could sign a transaction that would not be accepted by the network. So it's very important also for us to know what are the theoretical limits of the network, because if the network doesn't relay our emergency transaction, too bad,
Yeah, just so for the record, the limit I was talking about was about policy and not consensus, but yeah.
And then Bob's got a question. I'm just going to just on the follow up to that what you just said, Kevin. So you said heavier branch, and alarm went off in my head. Miniscript. Have you been using Miniscript to get the optimal script in terms of the weights of the different branches?
Yes and no. I started doing it, and then the requirements for our clients just didn't work out with Miniscript, because Miniscript doesn't factorize the same keys. So let's say if you have m out of n, it works. But if you start having different branches with multiple times the same key in different branches, Miniscript doesn't optimize on that. So manually, it was much easier to reduce the size and the cost of the transactions by looking at alternative way than what can be described in the Miniscript language. So yeah, we were just stuck because Miniscript doesn't realize that if you put like A as like 3 different PK public keys, it doesn't realize that it's the same public key. So it's not trying to optimize the weight of the transaction for that, which is annoying.
It can't identify that pub key that's been repeated is the same. Is that what you're saying? Okay,
Yeah.
and that's the only thing that Miniscript didn't have that forced you to not take advantage of Miniscript. That you can
yeah,
record.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, that's annoying. Okay, there's a question from Bob in the chat. Do you want to save the question, Bob, or I can repeat it?
Sure. So
go for it.
This is relayed from my collaborator, Jacob Swambo. He asks, can you guys talk a bit about your development roadmap for the various components and how other people in the ecosystem could participate, perhaps? I know you guys have a GitHub with your Revault demo, but there are other pieces here, including watchtowers, management of pre-signed transactions, etc. Can you talk a bit about your development roadmap and what all kind of the moving parts are and what needs to be developed?
I will let Antoine reply to that, but just to start with, there are different things there. So watchtowers, in my opinion, should be as generalistic as possible. So we shouldn't have just one implementation of watchtowers, in my opinion, because it's just the way watchtowers are designed. It doesn't require it to be all the same implementation. Yeah, I think that's the main thing I wanted to say. And then everything else, open source and stuff. So that's it. So Antoine, if you want to talk about how or what's next, go ahead.
Yeah, you've been working on it more than me, but we need to actually to go ahead. We need to.
You're a bit quiet, Antoine. Can you move towards the mic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me better?
Yeah, it's better now. Thanks.
We need to hire other people, and then so we need to raise some funds in order to create a company and fund it for about a year, which we expect to be the timeline for serving a first product. So yeah, so it's I said it was a big question in the chat because we are not we expect to achieve it, but we don't know if we'll be able to even raise funds. So yeah. Voilà.
Cool. And then I wanted to ask, because in the Socratic last week, Anton, we talked about transaction pinning problems, and Jeremy Rubin was saying that a lot of the problems are unlikely to be solved in the short term because there just needs to be a total re-architecting of the mempooling core. Any views on that? How much understanding do you have of the mempool on core, and how much is that going to be a problem going forward?
I don't want to make strong statements about it because I haven't been contributed much to core, but yeah, I know the inner working of the mempool, and yes, a complete refactoring, as Jeremy said last week, would be great, and for all of chain protocols actually. There's still one other attacks and transaction pinning for Lightning Network that was found about 2 weeks ago. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I think I understand the position also of the developers of Bitcoin Core. Yeah, you need to keep it stable, and just refactoring the whole thing out it's a strong choice to make. So we try to work out with the tools we have today. So I think the all anyone can pay thing is not that bad. I think it's pretty workable because there is only one restriction, which is really low, the C control from the RBF BIP. So yeah, I think we can work out without refactoring for us, but for the network, it would be great.
It is interesting that a number of not only this transaction pinning, but watchtowers, there's quite a few parallels in terms of the challenges posed to Lightning and vaults. So I suppose you're well placed, Antoine, to be working on both.
So that's actually why I went to Antoine in the first place. Like working on just opCSV, the check sequence verify on Bitcoin is a nightmare today. It should be very simple because it's been implemented in Core a long time ago, but you still cannot do even with Core, you cannot do your own CSV transactions. Like it's really hard to find proper tools for that. So now when looking at, Lightning developers, every single one of them have been playing with this because it's a requirement for Lightning. So yeah, to me, like the requirement was like finding people who have experience working with opCSV because it's really important.
Cool. Anybody on the call have any questions? No? I'm sure Bob has some questions or comments.
Only to say, great presentation, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
One other topic I'll bring up, the state chain conversation has gotten going on Bitcoin Dev. Also needs watchtowers. I see a generalized watchtower concept coming. So if people are interested in that, it's something to work on, and at least 3 different ways to use it: Lightning, vaults, and state chains.
Yeah, and watchtowers are really great because if used properly, they don't add any risk. And actually using more of them, like as many of them as you can, increase your security without decreasing anything. And this is quite exceptional. It's really rare in Bitcoin that, like usually when you add security somewhere, you are creating new risks. And watchtowers are, I think, the exception in Bitcoin, which is really cool.
So in an ideal world, if you were to raise funds and you could spend more time on this and hire more people, would you do a check template verified version of Revault?
Very good question. So today, no, because it's very, in my opinion, okay, that's more like personal and maybe also with experience being in Bitcoin for a while, do not waste, or at least do not spend too much time developing a product that requires something that is not in Bitcoin today. This is really risky. You don't know what will change. You don't even know if it will be added to Bitcoin at any point in time. And this is valid even for the very big thing, like, you take Schnorr. Some people were saying, even more than a year ago, oh yeah, Schnorr is there in 6 months. No, it's not. It's just Bitcoin takes time. If you developed like a really, really cool multi-sig system on Schnorr, Taproot, or Mast, whatever, great for you, but this doesn't work today. So the risk is way too high in terms of, if you want to think about business, the risk is too high to use tools that don't exist today. So yeah, that's probably the main reason why today we wouldn't even work on like a proper implementation that would be kind of production ready before CTV or no input would be added to Bitcoin.
Even in my talk, when I talked about check template verify, it was really from a high level point of view. I didn't tweak with it. I didn't even test if it worked. that was just something that it fits. It seems to fit the need, but I'm not even sure. And this is just this was just higher level, just to say.
Perhaps if you had the budget, then like Brian, I think Brian said he had done a CTV prototype. Maybe you'd do a prototype just to see where it would potentially, where the design would go in the future, but spend most of your resources on stuff that's actually in Bitcoin currently.
Yeah, and also on this, actually, Bitcoin is great for that there might be different use for the same thing. And so Watchtower is one of them, and there are already a few companies working on Watchtowers. So of course, these companies should be one of the main, early targets that we have to help us work on these problems. It's cool. We can probably do everything in-house, but that's not the point. If other people already are working on really cool stuff, it's really good to help each other. And also, I think it's starting to be more and more common that companies in Bitcoin do their product open source. Sadly, in custody, that is not the case. You are not going to find many tools open source outside, multi-sig wallets, basically. And that is not great. When you're dealing with like multiple hundreds of millions of dollars, how, like, I don't know, like there is no backend, nothing that is open source today for securing hundreds of millions. That is not normal. So maybe we can, like vaults in general, not just us, could help, pave the way forward to start to have some kind of a visibility on how it works at custodians as well.
I suppose it's whether you want security and obscurity or whether you want a battle-tested open source solution, right?
Yeah, so in Bitcoin and other open source projects, we talk a lot about, obscurity being an enemy sometimes of security. That is okay for everything online. But as soon as you work towards physical threats, obscurity is always stronger. And this is, at least for now, and this is a problem that we have in security in general. It's easier to protect yourself if the people don't know the layout of your house. It is easier to protect yourself if they don't know if you have a gun or not. It's a lot of things like this. And that's also the case with hardware security modules. So that's also the big debate, right? Is Trezor better because it's open source, or is Ledger better because it's using a closed source thing? And now, attacking a device that is not open source is really hard because you need equipment that costs a lot of money. But now, has it been reviewed enough? Is there a backdoor? It's always, it's always a compromise somewhere. But typically, when it's about physical security, obscurity is a great asset.
Okay, and the last one from me, if someone's interested in learning more or potentially contributing to Revault in the future, what would you advise?
I don't know. Depends. If somebody really wants to move forward on just the idea of vaults, I think right now it's good that we kind of know each other. So dealing with Brian, with Bob, and Spencer, Jacob, it's a really small crowd, and I think we're all going along well with each other. So hopefully we can keep moving forward and reviewing each other's work and contributing to each other's work. Because as every security product, you need a lot of auditing and review as well. If you put millions of dollars on it, you need to make sure it's working. And as you've seen in this presentation, it's a lot of edge cases, a lot of weird things, around fees and transaction pinning and weird things that nobody looks like at usually. So we have to keep digging because maybe we're missing a massive point. And miners as well is important. Usually we assume, the mining is secure. We're only thinking about, the script. But the script is not everything. Bitcoin still has human players. And as Antoine was saying, if a miner is the attacker, what do we do? It's starting to be much harder. So yeah, there is a lot of things we need to look at, and it's not necessarily only on the development side, it's a lot on the architecture. So there is that. Then for the architecture, right now we're looking at making a Rust implementation. That could still change, but right now that's what we're looking at, and there are more and more people contributing to Rust as well, which is good. So yeah, Square Crypto is contributing a lot, so that's good as well. So maybe we will start seeing a bigger and bigger Rust community in Bitcoin. What else can I say? Yeah, I don't know. Reaching out to us would be good as well. Like right now, Antoine said it. Like raising funds for us is a way to go, because we really want to put that in production. There have been a lot of Vault proposals over the years, but sadly, none of them is available as a product. The best we can find today is Python demo, which is cool, but it's not something you would put your money on. So at the very beginning of this project, when I reached out to a few people, my idea was to make some kind of a non-profit foundation to sustain the development, while the users, let's say the exchanges and other companies, should have like a subscription with this non-profit. That could be a good way to go for the very long term. But for the short term, for us, just the paperwork for that kind of stuff and trying to figure out who would be subscriber is much more annoying than just generating normal revenue through invoicing. So invoicing is about, hey, how can you customize Revault for us? So that's some kind of service work we provide, and then every work is done in the open source, so we can release the software and everything to everyone. So for us, that's the way to go right now. It's private company, and later we will see. But definitely everything open source and no intellectual property as such behind it.
And the sales pitch is that whenever we have a bull market, there's going to be tons of smaller custodians that are going to need a solution like this. It's not just going to be the big exchanges. It's going to be more and more people needing to consider custodian solutions.
Yeah, we even thought about ATM operators and all. So even small players.
And another thing I want to add is that I don't understand why there is so few physical attacks in Bitcoin. Because the security of many businesses in Bitcoin is really low. I'm not saying people should do this. I'm just saying that it is really impressive that there are still people, going into your house to steal your TV, which is much harder to resell than if you were to go to a Bitcoin business and steal a Bitcoin. And so we are very lucky, I think, that for 11 years we had just a few physical attacks. But I don't think it's sustainable. If there is another big bull market, we will start seeing more criminal entering the space, and this is not good. We need better security, even if it's just better multisig, but we need better security than what we're using today. So to me, it's more that than just the price going up. It's much more the risk going up. And this is not good. Like I don't feel really safe, although I have a really, good key management, I think. But yeah, I would like to have more options on how I can do my my things with, like, possibly canceling transactions, even as a personal wallet. If I send Bitcoin to somebody, like how many times when you send Bitcoin to an address, how many times are you checking that the address is right? How many times are you checking that the amount is right? It's just, we put so much pressure on us, while we could just have a button to like allow us to, claw it back in 1 hour or whatever. So it's a lot of things that I would like to see.
And the exchanges have very complex. I mean, I don't have any more insight than you, but I've heard they have very complex cold storage solutions. So it's kind of complex physical security rather than complex like software security, or taking software security to its full potential. So there was a question to Bob in the chat. Maybe we'll get Bob involved. Perhaps, Bob, you can answer Antoine's question on what you think about minor censorship of revocation transactions. And then perhaps, I saw you dropped a paper as well, Bob, today. So perhaps you could summarize the paper that you published with Brian and Jacob, those guys.
Sure. So Antoine asks, what do I think of minor censorship of the revocation transactions? So minor censorship of transactions like that is a 51% attack, right? It only works if they have 50% of the hash power. And if that's the case, game over all around. So there's really nothing you can do about that. As to our paper, so we dropped our paper today. This is the first of 2 papers. The second one will focus more on kind of the mechanisms and deleted keys. The first one is an architecture that is similar to what the guys just talked about, but uses and we called things a little bit differently, and it uses deleted keys instead of the multi-sig. But so yeah, take a look for that. You can find it on Twitter. We all tweeted about it. But yeah, happy to have this conversation continue and come up with some interesting solutions.
What were the key findings of the paper?
This paper is not so much kind of a findings kind of paper. It's more of an engineering kind of paper where we described an architecture and analyzed some of its security properties.
Okay, cool. I look forward to reading it. I didn't have time today. I don't know when you dropped it. Okay, so unless a last chance for questions or comments from other guys in the call. I think everyone's been pretty quiet apart from Bob. Not seeing any activity. Okay, so as I wrap up, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, Antoine. Really interesting. Good luck for the future of Revault. I look forward to following your progress.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
See ya.
Cheers, guys.